Well, tonight we'll study a little bit more in Deuteronomy. We're on chapter 4, and we're going to study verse 10. Yes. Oh, yeah, we can. Sometimes when there's so few, I skip it. Well, that one week we had a whole bunch of people, but hopefully the next week we'll have at least 4 more than what we have here. Yeah. Okay, Deuteronomy 4:10. You remember when we started this chapter that I read a statement to you. Maybe I should read it again. This chapter is important for us to study in these last days. This is from Fundamentals 508. It says, I was referred to the 4th chapter of Deuteronomy. The whole of this chapter is to be studied. So whenever I read in one prophet the importance of another prophet's writing, it seems like it elevates it to be more important than some. I mean, everything's important, but... So I've been very interested in this chapter. Says, verse 10 says, especially the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God. If you have the book, we're on page 22, but especially the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they shall live upon the earth, and that they may teach their children. So Moses reminds them of the importance of Mount Sinai, and he points out the 2 things that God had in mind. Number 1, that the people would see the value of the 10 Commandments, so valuable that they would actually train their children to follow those commandments. Now, when we study the history of Israel, we see they didn't really do that very much. Most of their time was spent in apostasy. Most of their years were spent not following. However, there was always a remnant. There always is people that still do what God asks them to do, whether the majority do or not. So, we have to be that way today. In Patriarchs and Prophets 309, it says, the sacred precepts of the Decalogue, spoken amid thunder and flame, and with a wonderful display of the power and majesty of the great lawgiver. One thought has impressed itself upon me. God had several reasons why he demonstrated his power, but one of them is, I have enough power to help you keep the commandments. And this is where a lot of people are doubting today. They're thinking, well, I just can't do it. Well, it's true, you can't do it by yourself. But there's more than enough power in God's hands to do it. God accompanied the proclamation of his law with exhibitions of his power and glory, that his people might never forget the scene, and that they might be impressed with profound veneration for the author of the law, the creator of heaven and earth, he would also show to all men the sacredness, the importance, the permanence of his law. So there are some of the lessons that we're supposed to get from this chapter. The impression that was given in regard to the law was to be so strong that they would never forget the scene and never forget the commandments, but also that they would see those commandments as very, very sacred, that they would see they were very important, and that they did not stand to be removed. In other words, they would never be removed. In order for them to be removed, he would have to have a scene similar and tell us that they've been removed. But that has never happened, and so it still is as solid as it was. From Lift Him Up, page 121, it says, those only who read the scriptures, and notice what it says, as the voice of God, speaking to them, are true learners. They tremble at the voice of God, for to them it is a living reality. So on Mount Sinai, he actually did it, but we are supposed to think every time we read any portion of the Bible, or any portion of Ellen White for that matter, I don't think there's degrees of prophets. So if the Bible we're supposed to read as the voice of God, then we're supposed to read her writings as the voice of God also. And, that means we don't neglect what it says. And our job is not to argue with what it says or to explain away what it says, but our job is to find out and make sure we understand exactly what it said. Because what it actually said is the voice of God speaking to us. Yes.
Well, I think Peter makes it clear, 2 Peter 2:19, says, holy men of God's faith as they were moved. And so, we know all the inspired word was a movement of the Holy Spirit. So
that's right. Even those parts that we might say, well, that doesn't measure with my idea of how the Spirit works, we have to accept it and believe that the misunderstanding comes because either translators didn't quite capture the exact idea or we don't understand something, but it's solid rock. Then he goes on with a little more description, verse 11. Someone like to read that?
And you came near and stood under the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire unto the midst of heaven, with darkness, clouds, and thick darkness.
So it was like this huge furnace, and it went up quite high. It says the midst of heaven. I'm not sure how high that was. I saw a video of a plane crash the other day that burst into flames as soon as it hit the ground. And wow, that fire went up a long ways. But this one probably went much higher, up into the midst of heaven, it says. But not only that, there was darkness as well. There were clouds. And the darkness is called thick darkness. So all sorts of things are going on while the Ten Commandments were being given to God's people.
Could that thick clouds, could that be of the smoke as a result of the intense burning? And like it said, rising so high?
Yeah, and probably
obscured the light of the sun?
Had to hide God's presence too, Yeah. Now, that's a reflection back on the account given in Exodus 19, verses 16 to 18. And it gives a few more details. It says there were thunders and lightnings. So it was like a storm. a huge lightning storm and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. So we have an earthquake, we have a storm, and I didn't put this in here, I don't think, but I read that there was lightning running on the ground, shooting in different places, and then this fire and the smoke, and no wonder the people were scared for what was going on. But it wasn't God's purpose to scare them, but to teach the lessons that we noticed earlier. David comments on this in Psalm 68:8. It says, "The earth shook, the heavens also dropped at the presence of God." That's an interesting thought. The heavens also dropped. Even Sinai itself was moved at the presence of God, the God of Israel. So this was intended to be an unforgettable experience. And since we weren't there, it's written to try to help us get as good a picture as we can of what happened back then. Okay, someone else read verse 12.
And the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but you saw no form. You only heard a voice.
Okay, so God did not reveal his form, but he did speak, and they heard very clearly. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 303, it says, God purposed to make the occasion of speaking his law a scene of awful grandeur, in keeping with its exalted character. And we know that the law is simply a list of the characteristics of Jesus, put in list form. And so there's nothing more exalted than the law. Yes?
Even the ordinary thunder and lightning that we see here is pretty impressive stuff.
That's true.
I was out in the yard in our home in New York one afternoon when the storm came up. I was probably 30 or 40 feet from the house. The one of them boomed close enough to me to make me run right quick to the porch.
Yeah. I remember for a while we lived on the top of one of the hills at Wildwood, a bigger hill than where we are now. And there was a high tension pole. High tension wires run all through Wildwood. And the lightning struck that pole, and it wasn't that far from our house. I mean, that was a scary. And
Pole or one of those towers? I see.
those metal
Yeah.
things, yeah, hit that and went down into the ground on that. Boy, that was, we were living in a garage at that time, and it was really close to that tower. The people were to be impressed that everything connected with the service of God must be regarded with the greatest reverence. Do we as Adventists need that lesson today? Unfortunately, in general, we're a very irreverent people. And as we gather together, there's a lot of noise. We don't realize that we're in God's presence, and we just do and say a lot of things that we wouldn't do if we had been at Mount Sinai and had learned the lesson. Now, I don't think most of them learned the lesson, but the lesson they were supposed to learn was one of reverence. And that whenever you come into God's presence, it's a time to pay attention. It's a time to be focused on spiritual things. It's a time to make sure we don't miss the blessing that God has in mind.
One thing that happens, sometimes when people are leading in prayer, they'll have Father this, Lord this, every other sentence down through their prayer. I looked that up because I found it a little irritating. If you spoke to me and used my name in every sentence to get my attention again. But in Book of Education, page 243, she says that the unnecessary and repeated use of God's name in prayer should be avoided.
Right. Well, we'll get to chapter 5. Well, it could be a while because chapter 4 has a lot in it. But when we get to chapter 5, we're going to go through the commandments one by one. And if you haven't done that recently, you'll be surprised at how broad those commandments are. 8th Testimonies 198. By proclaiming the 10 Commandments to the children of Israel with his own voice, God demonstrated their importance. The commandments stand above the whole Bible because the rest of the Bible was written by who? Yeah, prophets. But God said, I'm not going to trust a prophet to give the 10 Commandments. I'm going to give that myself. And so this elevates it far beyond. In awful grandeur, he made known his majesty and authority as the ruler of the world. This he did to impress the people with the sacredness of his law and the importance of obeying it. So the sacredness of it and the importance of obeying it. We should never explain away anything in the 10 Commandments or make it sound like we don't need to do that. The power and glory with which the law was given reveal its importance. And here, this was an eye-opener to me. I had read in Jude about the faith that was once delivered to the saints, but I didn't really realize what it was until I found this sentence. It is the faith once delivered to the saints by Christ our Redeemer, speaking from Sinai. So, as I thought about it, I said, yeah, that's the only thing that was delivered. God took tables of stone, he wrote the 10 Commandments on the tables of stone, and he handed it to Moses. He delivered it to Moses. The rest of it, he told Moses, or whatever prophet it was. But this part he delivered into their hands. And notice it calls it the faith. The faith of our fathers is to obey the 10 Commandments, because that's the faith that was once delivered to the saints. Okay, someone read verse 13.
So he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, the 10 Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tables of stone.
Notice how many ways the commandments were given. He spoke it, then he wrote it upon 2 tables of stone. Stone is the most enduring thing, and that's a lesson in itself, I believe. But notice one special phrase here. He declared unto you his covenant. Now, we have a number of references, we won't read them all, but in Genesis 9 it talks about the everlasting covenant. In Genesis 17, when he's talking to Abraham, he talks about the token of the covenant, which was circumcision. That was a token of the covenant. And then in Genesis 26:5, we'll read that one. It says, Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So this, I think, is a proof text that the Ten Commandments were known before Mount Sinai, and that Abraham had received those 10 Commandments down through the 20 patriarchs. He was the last one. They passed a knowledge of those 10 Commandments. And Abraham knew what they were, and he kept those commandments long before Mount Sinai happened. Yes?
He tried to keep it, but he lied.
Well, yeah, he had to be forgiven for that one. Yes.
Well, Abraham, I think you're right. I mean, that was 400 years before this. But what my comment was about the covenant, I'm glad that you're commenting on it. You know, a covenant is only ratifiable or good if both parties enter into it.
That's right. That's right. I'll just give you a quick view of my understanding of the covenants. There's basically 3 covenants in the Bible. There's the everlasting, that was the first one given. It wasn't called that when God spoke to Adam and Eve, but that's the one he gave them, the everlasting covenant. And then we see that one, the first place we see the name is after the flood in Genesis 9. Then we have at Mount Sinai the Old Covenant, and then we have the New Covenant. And that's also brought out in the Old Testament. So the everlasting covenant is identical to the New Covenant. If you check the promises and the arrangement that God made, it's identical to the New Covenant, which means that as far as human beings are concerned, the New Covenant is older than the Old Covenant. And nobody was ever saved except Jesus. Nobody was ever saved under the Old Covenant. There's a false concept that at Mount Sinai God made an Old Covenant and the people from that time on were saved under the Old Covenant. But it's impossible for human beings to be saved under the Old Covenant because you have to perfectly obey. Never mess up even once.
So nothing depends on merit.
Right. Now the covenant, the Old Covenant, was made at Sinai, but it was broken at Sinai as well. And that was the end of it. The Old Covenant only lasted for a couple of days, or, well, it may have been longer than that. When Moses came down from the mount and he saw them, worshiping the idol, he threw down those tables of stone, and that was the end of the Old Covenant. Even though he gave the 10 Commandments again, wrote them on tables of stone and all that, but the Old Covenant was broken. Now, I do think the Old Covenant has a function. If somebody thinks they can keep the commandments by their own power, God will accept that covenant with them. But that doesn't mean they can be saved by that. It just means God's saying, if you want to try that, go ahead. If you think you can obey those commandments on your own, go ahead and try. But when a person comes to the realization, I've been trying and trying, and I can't seem to keep those commandments, maybe my case is hopeless, God says, try the New Covenant. I have a better covenant. The New Covenant is based on my promise of what I can do for you. I can change your heart. I can write my commandments in your heart. I can give you a desire to do it. I can give you power to do it. So what happens is that a lot of people, when they wake up to the fact that they can't keep the old covenant, they feel that obedience is no longer necessary. No, that's not what God is saying. He's just saying, whenever you try on your own, you're going to fail. But you won't fail if you try in my power, because my power is sufficient. And that's the thing that I see Seventh-day Adventists losing today. Big time. Losing that belief. And there are some places that if I speak too boldly about that, I can get in trouble. Yes.
So, Pastor, how do we accomplish this? Is that because of faith in what Christ did for you, or just straight to the Father?
Yeah, well, the whole Godhead is involved in, helping us, but the secret of success is, number one, believing that he has the power to keep us from falling. The second is to actually put our trust in him. Because if we look to him and say, Lord, I'm trusting you for the power to say no to this, we will never fall while we're doing that. We will be able to be successful. Now, Satan tries to trick us. He tries to come at us when we don't know that he's coming at us. So sometimes we don't ask because we don't realize what's going on. But we learn. Even then, we learn to be careful the next time. And when we see temptation approaching, that's when we need to ask for the help. Because he has the power to keep us from falling. That's what Jude tells us. Unto him that is able to keep us from falling. And when you read, especially in Ellen White's writings about Jesus as our example, he showed us how you can obey. Now, the difference between Jesus and us is that Jesus always trusted his divine power. We don't. Sometimes we try it on our own, and that's when we fall. But we learn over time. We learn, don't trust your own power. Trust his power. Put yourself in his hands. Ask for him to assist you. And believe that he has assisted you. And you will be able to say no to it. Now, do I do that every time? No, not yet. But I'm gaining ground from what I used to do. And so I'm not going to give up the belief that I can make it the rest of the way to where I learn to always trust in his power. Yes.
Okay, where does the robe of Christ's righteousness comes in here? Because we were taught a couple of months ago that we don't need Christ's robe of righteousness because the Father sees our hearts. I don't even understand that.
Well, the robe of righteousness, as I understand it, is to make up for the shortfall with us.
True.
Yeah.
That's what I know.
Right. So what we fail to live out is made up for by the robe of righteousness.
But if we don't need that, because it's useless for us,
Well, we will always need it. We will. There's no way to get beyond needing his robe of righteousness. However, he also, there's two, I hate to say two robes of righteousness, okay, but for illustration purposes, I'll say there's two robes. One is what you get at conversion, and it makes up for everything you don't have yet. The second robe of righteousness is when you let Him live out His life through you. You know, we have that song, "Live out thy life within me." Okay, when we allow Him to live out His life through us, that is also a robe of righteousness.
Yes.
It's the same one, actually, but just for illustration, we'll list it as two. Now, that's the one that's not being talked about right now. They talk about the first one, but not about the second one. But if you read, like in Christ Object Lessons, it makes a real point about that one. That, and even the Bible, in Revelation 19, let's just read it. Revelation 19. Verse 8. The very last phrase of Revelation 19, verse 8. Says, we'll back up just to get the context. Verse 7, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to Him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and His wife," that's us, "His wife hath made herself ready." Well, what does it mean, made herself ready? "And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white. For the fine linen is the" what? Yes, righteousness of saints. Not righteousness of Jesus, although it came from Him. But it says this getting ready has to do with Jesus living His life through us until we become like Him. And now we have the righteousness of saints.
I think that's what our pastor meant. He said that it's our relationship with God, not Jesus' robe of righteousness, that would save us.
Well, we need both, really. We need both because once you fall, no matter how good you live afterward, it doesn't make up for it. So you have to have both of these robes or both aspects of this righteousness. You have to have both. Otherwise, you couldn't be saved. You see, to be saved, we have to have never done one wrong thing ever in our whole life. Well, there's only one way we can make it, and that is to have His perfect righteousness covering us. But as we near the end especially, we're going to have the righteousness of saints because we're going to be so connected with Jesus that He will be able to live His life through us. And I believe that's important right now because we're almost at the end. Yes?
And that will be when we are sealed.
We'll be sealed then, that's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and He can't really seal us until that happens, you know?
And sealing time is going on now, right?
Possibly, although I think the major sealing takes place when the latter rain starts to fall. That's also the sealing time. And I don't think we're quite there yet. We do see a lot of the Holy Spirit's work, but I think it's still early rain. I don't think it's latter rain yet from what I've studied.
And that's before the last plagues.
Before the last plagues, yeah. That's right. Well, let's just look at, well, we didn't read that one, I guess, from, yeah, I did. Let's look at a few others. I didn't put spirit of prophecy in here because it would be a huge, a huge thing, but I just put some of the key Bible texts. Jeremiah 11, verse 3, for instance. It says, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Cursed be the man that obeyeth not the words of this covenant." So, you know, you have to perfectly obey to be saved under the old covenant. And if you break it even once, it says you're cursed. Well, Jesus took the curse for us so that we could be free from that curse. And then Jeremiah 31, verse 33. Here is clearly the new covenant. It says, "But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days." What were those days? When Jesus would come to this earth. "That I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord." And notice this, "I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people." So God has made a wonderful promise. Let's take him at his word. He said, "I will create a desire to obey in your heart. So that when you do it, it's because I created that desire in you." You're not going to say, "Well, do we really have to do this? Or can I get by with not doing this?" We're not going to say that. We're going to say, "Thank you, Lord, for making me willing to do this." And when we're willing to do it, there's a good likelihood we'll do it. But we still need the power of Jesus to make it possible to do it. Notice how similar that is to Hebrews 8, verse 10. It says, "This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people." It's almost a direct quote. So, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, God has presented the value of the New Covenant because no one could be saved under the Old Covenant. Yes.
I have a renegade Adventist friend that says the one in Hebrews 8 is all different.
Really?
I can't believe he believes that, but he has enough background to know that's not true.
He'd be a hard put to prove that.
Hope couldn't be more direct.
Yeah. And then Hebrews 10:16. "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them." Now, we do have, I believe, an advantage since Jesus came to this earth. Before Jesus came, there was no example that it could be done. Even though, God promised, "I will write my law in your heart." Abraham failed on some occasions. David failed. And even though there's no sin recorded about Daniel or about Joseph, I believe they sinned because the Bible says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So there was no example to look to and really strengthen their faith that through Christ it can be done. But now we have it. Now we can look back and we can see Jesus was human. He had the same body we do, the same brain that we do, and he was able to obey. So it's possible for us to obey if we get all these benefits from the Lord that he said he would give to us. And of course, if we don't have it, we can ask because he wants to do it. All right. Verse 13 also. We're going to look a little bit at the phrase, "He wrote them upon 2 tables of stone." Story of Redemption, page 148. "He did not trust them to be taught by anyone, not even his angels, but spoke his law with an audible voice in the hearing of all the people. He did not even then trust them to the short memory of a people who were prone to forget his requirements, but wrote them with his own holy finger upon tables of stone. All this is to help us realize how valuable, how important these 10 Commandments are, and no tampering with these 10 Commandments. If man had kept the law of God as given to Adam after his fall, so it's very clear, you can't necessarily prove that from the Bible, but in a way you can. I mean, by deduction, you can say, well, if Abraham knew about the 10 Commandments, where did he learn it from? And you can trace it back to Adam. Then it says, preserved in the ark by Noah. So Noah, and I don't know that they had it written out back then, because I believe they had perfect recall, that whatever they were told they could tell you, So it was preserved in the ark by Noah and observed by Abraham. There would have been no necessity for the ordinance of circumcision. See, God keeps adding things as he goes through the Bible to keep people understanding how important the law is. So he gave circumcision now. First thing he gave was the rainbow, so that the commandments would be remembered. Then he gave circumcision, so that they would remember the commandments. And if the descendants of Abraham had kept the covenant, of which circumcision was a token or pledge, they would never have gone into idolatry or been suffered to go down into Egypt. Isn't that amazing? Their stay in Egypt was unnecessary. Why did they go into Egypt? Because they didn't obey the commandments. That's always the source of the problem. Whatever trouble comes upon God's people is because they didn't obey the commandments. Now, of course, we suffer for righteousness' sake too, but generally speaking, the trouble that we have comes from disobedience. Yes.
Isn't Egypt symbolically atheism to the south? I mean, Solomon was warned not to go to Egypt and solicit help there or buy a great deal of horses. And, I've got that wrong? Or?
Yeah, symbolically, that's what it represents. Yeah. But the point we're looking at here is they could have stayed in Canaan if they had obeyed the commandments. The reason they ended up being sent down to Egypt and thus get into slavery and all the other problems that they had, it was all because of disobedience. It says they would never have gone into idolatry or been suffered to go down into Egypt. And there would have been no necessity of God's proclaiming his law from Sinai and engraving it upon tables of stone. So Sinai was unnecessary if they had obeyed. Each generation, if they had cherished the 10 Commandments and had followed them, God would never have had to tell them from Sinai. So people use Sinai as trying to teach that that's the beginning of the 10 Commandments. But actually, it wasn't even necessary unless they had disobeyed. That's why it became necessary.
The statement about the idolatry. I mean, idolatry was the worst curse on Israel. century after century after century.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she's saying here could have been avoided all the other animal trees.
Yeah, that's right.
The groves and the high places and the mountains.
Yeah. Now, I sort of have the belief, there's some, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago too, but there's a statement in early writings, and I forget the page now, but it says that if we had been truly obedient to God, the world would be scared to touch us.
I've heard that before.
Have you?
Yes, sir.
They would leave us alone. So that has led me, plus all the history that's in the Bible, to believe that the final persecution that we will have in this world will be brought on by ourselves. It's not something God would prefer for us to go through. But we have to go through it because we drifted too far away from His plan. And if it wasn't us, although we're probably involved too, there's others in the church that have drifted away. And let me just share one particular thing that I think is going to bring trouble upon us. There's we're quite strong against prayer in schools. And other people, Christian people, look at us and they say, well, why in the world, if they call themselves Christians, why are they against prayer in schools? And in the Spalding McGann collection, we were told not to oppose prayer in schools. And I think you can see why we should not do that. If we oppose things that are godly, then we look ungodly. And so we do things that actually are going to come down upon us and make us look pretty bad. Now, I believe in separation of church and state,
That's the issue.
definitely, but I don't believe in opposing prayer in schools. That's it's not an issue, really. And I wrote, sending that quote to the Religious Liberty Department some time ago, but I never got an answer from them. But I thought, well, maybe they haven't noticed this, so I thought I better send it. But what we need to have is a practical separation of church and state, not a theoretical separation of church and state. When you get too theoretical, you get over into things that don't make sense to a lot of people, and we need to be careful about that. But of course, we know we're going to lose our religious liberty